New Light on Atlantis and the Exodus, the Institute for the Comparative Study of History, Philosophy, and the Sciences. Autumn Lecture 1962 by J.G.Bennett. First Series, Natural Catastrophes That Change History. Second Lecture, Monday, October 8, 1962. This article expands upon the hypothesis that Atlantis was destroyed by the Thera eruption. Although not necessarily pointing to Egypt as the location of the island of Atlantis, this paper instead focuses on the calamity that triggered the story and the connection with Egypt on the Exodus, supporting the hypothesis laid down by other papers that Egypt is a strong candidate. Without further ado, here's the AI audio essay by J.G.Bennett.
The subject of my lecture tonight is, in my opinion, one of the most remarkable developments in our knowledge of Greek and biblical history since Schliemann rediscovered Troy. I make bold to say this because I personally do not claim any of the credit, which is due to Professor Angelos G. Gallinopoulos, head of the Seismological Department of the University of Athens, whose published articles and information sent to me in private correspondence have provided the key to an interpretation of Plato's story of Atlantis that is, I am sure, the right one. I myself reached further conclusions, particularly as regards the connection between the destruction of Atlantis and the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt. For these conclusions, I alone take the responsibility. They are so startling that I put them forward at this stage only as striking illustrations of the general theme of these lectures, that there is a providential connection between things that happen to the earth and many events of human history, both great and small. I hope to convince you that one single prodigious catastrophe was responsible for the destruction of Atlantis, for the flood of Deucalion described in Greek literature, and for the plagues of Egypt which made the Exodus possible. We must begin with Plato's story. I shall assume that you have all read the relevant passages of the Timaeus and the Critias. The first question is whether the story is and is intended to be an historical account of events that actually occurred, or whether, as most scholars have supposed, a myth invented by Plato to illustrate his theme. I am sure that Plato intended the story of Atlantis to be read as history. It is not really relevant to the subject matter of the Timaeus, and Plato seems to have brought it in because he was genuinely impressed by what he had heard from Critias. He refers to it several times as an authentic tradition, whereas in the case of other stories, for example the tale in Book 10 of the Timaeus of the son of Arminius the Pamphylian, he speaks of tales which have been preserved. No one who reads the Timaeus and Critias and compares the account of Atlantis with the tales and fables in other dialogues can doubt that Plato believed that the kingdoms of Atlantis really existed and were suddenly destroyed by a catastrophe. Moreover, he gives a clear account of how the story came to his knowledge. He says that Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens, had in his early travels visited Egypt, and while discussing the story of the flood of Deucalion had been told by the Egyptian priests that the Greeks were mere babes who had no knowledge of the ancient past. He had then been told the story in which the Athenians played a dramatic and noble part, and had decided to write an epic poem. The old Critias, who had known Solon, was convinced that the poem would have been written, but for Solon's preoccupation with Athenian affairs, and that it would have rivaled or even surpassed Homer's Iliad. When Jowett made his translation of Plato, he dismissed the story of Atlantis as an invention of Plato himself, with no historical foundation whatsoever. The same skeptical attitude was shown towards the Homeric poems and the stories of the Old Testament. Archaeological discovery has shown that all this skepticism was unjustified. Since Schliemann rediscovered Troy and Mycenae, our attitude to Homer has become one of great respect for his historical accuracy, and the same is true of Herodotus. This applies even more strikingly to many of the stories of the Bible. The tendency today is to take ancient traditions very seriously, and this alone should justify us in accepting Plato's assessment of the Atlantis story as probably correct. When, however, we come to study the story itself, we find that there are contradictions that make it impossible to take the whole of it literally. These contradictions concern the chronology on the one hand and the description of the culture and relationships of Atlantis on the other. According to the story told by Critias, Solon was informed by the Egyptian priests that Athens had existed 9,000 years before and had been engaged in a life and death struggle with the kings of Atlantis when the great destruction suddenly occurred. He also adds that the story was written down 1,000 years later. This in itself throws doubt upon the chronology even before we begin to study its implications. Very little knowledge of the discoveries of ancient history and prehistory is enough to convince us that the description of Atlantis given by Plato applies to a Bronze Age civilization. Now, the Bronze Age dates from about 2200 to 1000 BC. Before 3000 BC, all the peoples of the world were still in the Neolithic or New Stone Age. After 1000 BC, the Age of Iron began. There is no description of iron in Plato's story of Atlantis, but there are many references to gold, copper, orichalcum, and, most significant of all, to tin. These references justify us in fixing with confidence the extreme limits of the Age of Atlantis as being between 2200 BC and 1000 BC. The date alleged to have been given by the Egyptian priests works out at 11,500 years before the present. At that time, northern Europe was still in the throes of the last ice age, and although the glaciers had not reached the Mediterranean, the climate must have been far too cold for the way of life that the Atlanteans enjoyed. In any case, it is quite certain that there were no Egyptian priests 11,500 years ago to observe and make records of historical events. The ancient history of Egypt has been established in great detail. Although some early dates are still in dispute, there is no doubt at all that the use of writing did not reach Egypt until 3500 BC, at the earliest. That is, 5,000 years later than the Egyptian priests were supposed to have written down the story of Atlantis. The solution of the problem is, I think, quite obvious. The description of the culture of Atlantis can be accepted, but the chronology must be rejected. Very probably Solon made a mistake in interpreting the story he received, and read 1000 for 100. This might have happened also in the transmission of the story by Critias. If we correct the 9,000 years to 900 years, the destruction of Atlantis would fall between 1400 and 1500 BC. This admirably fits the description. That time was the height of the Bronze Age civilization, and there was a great development of shipping and commerce. The types of buildings and the way that people lived and behaved in all parts of the world, of which we have some record, agree quite well with the description in the Critias of Plato. The mistake is a simple one and easily made, and it does not detract from the historical value of Plato's account. Now, if there was a mistake in the reading of a symbol whereby 100 was read as 1000, this would no doubt apply not only to duration of time, but also to distances, and it is very probable, therefore, that when Plato refers to the great plain of Atlantis as being 3,000 by 2,000 stadia in extent, we should read 300 by 200 diviestia stadionu, as the old stadium was about 600 feet. This is 100 times 70 miles instead of 1,000 times 7,002. The smaller figure is far more plausible because in the second millennium BC there were no means of measuring distances as great as 1,000 miles. It seems, therefore, that we can make sense of the whole of Plato's story if we change 9,000 years into 900, and the size of the plain of Atlantis from 1,000 by 700 to 100 by 70 miles. This latter change makes it unnecessary to suppose, as Plato did, that the island of Atlantis must be situated in the Atlantic Ocean, and there are good reasons for supposing that it must have been in the eastern Mediterranean, partly on account of the names, and partly on account of the reference to Hercules, whose journeys and labours were confined to the eastern Mediterranean. Geologists are quite satisfied that there has not been within the last 10,000 years a great island in the middle of the Atlantic, and in any case an island of such size could not possibly have disappeared in a sudden convulsion of the kind that Plato describes. Correction. There is apparently a mistake in my arithmetic here, since I was accounting in yards instead of feet. So I stand corrected. Either way, we are therefore free to look much nearer to Athens for the site of Atlantis, and I think there is no doubt that Professor Gallinopoulos is right in identifying the larger island of Atlantis with the island now called Crete. This suggestion is not new. I believe it was first made by an anonymous writer to the Times newspaper on the 19th of February 1909, drawing attention to the remarkable similarity between Plato's description of the main island and the central plain of Crete. The following brief description will probably suffice. Crete, one of the largest islands in the Mediterranean, is about 160 miles long and varies in breadth from about 35 miles in the middle to 10 between Rethymno and Sfakia, and only 6 miles in one place between the Gulf of Mirabello and the coast of Hierapitra. Deep gulfs indent its northern coast, and its southern shore is rugged and rock-bound. A ridge of hills extends from east to west, culminating about the centre in well-wooded Mount Sailoriti, the ancient Mount Ida, which rises to a height of about 8,159 feet. Strabo called the hills in the western part of the island Loca Ore, or the White Mountains. In the southwest, the mountains almost fringe the shore. The ancient capital was situated at Knossos, near Candia, on the north. In ancient days, the island was 4 days' sail from Egypt and 2 from Cyrenaica. It may well be said of Crete, as of Atlantis, that there was a passage hence for travellers of that day to the rest of the islands, as well as from those islands to the whole opposite continent. In the Critias, Plato says of Atlantis that there are mountains surrounding the plain, assuming Plato is not conflating with other regional descriptives. This would then fit admirably into what we know of Crete 3,500 years ago. The sites that have been excavated at Knossos and Phaistos, at Hagia Triada and Vasiliki lie in just such a plain with just such surroundings as Plato describes. There are, however, far more convincing reasons for identifying Plato's Atlantis with Minoan Crete. Crete was a thalassocracy, the first great sea power in history. Its strength lay in its fleet. Plato says the same of Atlantis. Poseidon, the sea god, was the protective deity of Atlantis, as befits a nation whose very existence depended upon sea power. The symbol of Poseidon was the trident, which also occurs in many of the Cretan frescoes. The sacred animal of Poseidon was the bull, and the Minoan paintings and sculptures represent the bull as the central theme of their cult. The bull is probably the decisive link between Plato's Atlantis and Minoan Crete. Plato describes the way in which the kings of Atlantis hunt the bull without weapons at the time of their great sacred festivals held every 6 or 7 years. The famous fresco at Knossos, usually called the Toreador fresco, shows just such an exploit. As you know, the legend of the Minotaur was associated with King Minos of Crete, and very probably the story told about Theseus of the young men and women sent to be sacrificed to the Minotaur refers to an ancient memory of the sacred meetings described by Plato in connection with Atlantis. There are many such parallels. Plato says that after the bull hunt, the kings of Atlantis put on splendid blue robes. The frescoes of Knossos show that blue were the royal colour, and there is evidence that the blue dye first reached Asia from the Cretan traders. Here again, the link between Atlantis and Minoan Crete is suggested. The Minoan civilization is known chiefly from the archaeological work of Sir Arthur Evans, Hogarth and Mackenzie. For more than 2,000 years, from 3,500 BC to 1,400 BC, Crete was the seat of the most advanced culture of the Mediterranean. Until about 2,600, it was a Neolithic, that is, late Stone Age culture. Then came copper and other metals, and not long after, tin, and with tin, bronze. It is just possible that the Cretans first discovered the way to make bronze just because they had the sea trade that brought tin from the west, even from as far as Cornwall. Whatever may have been the reason, in about 2,600 BC Crete achieved an extraordinary degree of prosperity. The great palaces were built, and Cretan trade began to penetrate into all parts of the inhabited world. About 1700 BC, there was destruction, probably not due to enemy action, but to an earthquake. This was local, and palaces were soon rebuilt, and the Cretan thalassocracy was re-established. There was destruction between 1400 and 1450 BC, which was so terrible that the Minoan power was destroyed forever. This brief history of Crete fits Plato's description if we suppose that the final destruction was due to earthquakes and volcanoes. There is, however, one striking omission. Plato refers to Atlantis as being a federation of 10 kingdoms, and to the presence of a small but sacred island, which was the place where Poseidon had first established the future rulers of Atlantis. If Plato's story is history, there must have been a small island near to Crete, upon which there stood a temple, and the other buildings described in minute detail in the Critias. This is where Professor Gallinopoulos has made a decisive contribution to our knowledge. He has given good reasons for supposing that the sacred island was Strongheil, now known as Santorin, situated some 60 miles north of Crete. It has long been known that this island was formerly an extinct volcano, which blew up 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, producing a great crater or caldera, which has since been partly filled by fresh eruptions from under the sea. Gallinopoulos, by obtaining the samples of carbon from under the layers of volcanic dust thrown out at the time of the explosion, and subjecting them to the method of radiocarbon dating, has established that the catastrophe occurred 3,370, plus or minus 100 years, before the present, that is, within 100 years of 1470 BC. This date agrees with the archaeological estimates of the time of the final destruction of the palace of Knossos, which is placed at the end of the 14th century BCE. I shall give you reasons later for supposing that the precise date was 1447 BC. This is somewhat earlier than the time assigned by archaeologists to the destruction of Knossos, but certainly it is not inconsistent. Professor Gallinopoulos himself has suggested a date of 1550 BC, but this is certainly too early to fit in with the archaeological evidence. Now the question comes whether the great submarine volcanic eruption in Santorini could have produced the destruction of Minoan Crete. This destruction was so devastating that all the palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, Hagia Triada, Gurma, Moklos, Mania and Zakros were completely destroyed. Very probably the entire population was wiped out, because no attempt was made to rebuild, and the later and pitiful revival was almost certainly made by immigrants from the mainland, from Mycenae and Tiryns. Last week, I gave you some examples of the destructive power of great earthquakes and referred to the special terror that accompanies the eruption of a submarine volcano. I told you how the volcano of Krakatau in Java, which erupted from under the sea in 1883, produced tidal waves that caused devastation for hundreds of miles and killed 40,000 people in a matter of hours. A more recent example is the Great Alaskan Earthquake of the 10th of July, 1958. In the Seismological Society of America, there is a description of the giant wave in Lituya Bay by D. Miller. The wave produced by the explosion raised the waters to a height of 1,800 feet. This is shown by the fact that they actually poured over the top of a mountain 1720 feet high. To a height of 700 feet above sea level, everything was denuded. Trees were ripped up by the root, and the whole mountainside was laid bare. The following quotation from Miller's description will give you some idea of the tremendous destruction. The great volcanic earthquake of 1450 BC was far more terrible even than Krakatoa or Lituya Bay. I myself visited Santorini in May 1925, the day after there had been a small eruption of the submarine volcano. This was the most tremendous natural catastrophe that I've ever seen. The waters of the sea rushed into the cavity full of molten lava, and the resulting explosion threw great rocks, as big as houses, hundreds of feet into the air. The cloud of steam and dust rose 4,000 or 5,000 feet and formed a mushroom, just like those that we see in photographs of atom bomb explosions. The sea all round was boiling and covered with pumice stone and sulphur. The decks of the ship were covered with dust to a depth of several inches. Now, this explosion in 1925 was less than a 10,000th of the intensity of the great explosion of 1450 BC. To give you some idea of its prodigious intensity, I will make a comparison with Krakatoa. There, the crater or caldera was some 14 square miles, and its depth about 600 feet. The caldera at Santorini was 35 square miles, and from 1,000 to 1,500 feet deep. The ash thrown out at Krakatoa over an area of some 10,000 square miles had an average thickness of a foot. At Santorin, the actual thickness of the ash and dust was from 100 to 130 feet. I myself went and visited the eastern side of the island, where the layers of ash and volcanic dust have been laid bare by wind action. It is one of the most desolate and terrifying places that I have seen. It is hard to imagine that those great cliffs of volcanic dust were produced in a matter of days. The thermal energy of the eruption, as Santorin in 1450 or 1600 BC, has been calculated by Professor Peter Hidavari, 3 at 200,000 million kilowatt hours. To give you some idea of the amount of energy released, I have calculated that this is enough to raise 400 million tons of seawater to a height 5,000 feet. There must have been an enormous tidal wave more terrifying than any description. At the center of the explosion, it must have risen to a height of several thousand feet. Can you picture a mountain of water hundreds of feet high, rising out of the ocean and spreading out in every direction with all the added intensity of a landlocked ocean like the Mediterranean? The great wave must have swept southward 60 miles to Crete, smashing everything in front of it. Such a wave would perhaps be the only explanation of the destruction of central Crete, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. There is direct evidence of this wave reaching great heights, for lumps of pumice stone have been found to a height of 600 or 700 feet on the island of Anafi. Pumice stone carried by the waves has also been found on the mountains Crete, 100 feet or more above the level of the sea. Not only this, but they have been found on the coast of Syria and in Greece, showing that the all over the Aegean Sea, flooding even Egypt. In this destruction, the whole of the Minoan fleet perished, and probably the population was killed. except those who were living on the mountain. This agrees with the description given by Plato, where he says that all those who possessed the art of writing perished in the catastrophe, and only a few illiterate shepherds survived on the mountainside, and they were unable to transmit to their descendants the story of the splendid civilization that had been destroyed. And in the explosion of Santorini, we have the historical event which Plato describes, but we also have an explanation of the failure to discover the small sacred island and the temple of the sea god, which stood just where the center of the island disappeared into the sea. This you will see when I show you the pictures of the island and the plans of the temple. Professor Gallinopoulos made a drawing of the metropolis of Atlantis, according to Plato's description, and has shown how exactly it fits into the plan of the island of Santorini. It seems, therefore, that the riddle of Atlantis has finally been solved. Before I leave the subject of Atlantis and Deucalion's flood, I would like to refer again to Plato's reference to the 10 kingdoms of Atlantis, from the destruction of Minoan objects in Egypt, Syria, Greece, Italy, and Sardinia. It seems quite likely that the naval power of Crete held sway over the area described by Plato as stretching as far as Libya and the Tyrrhenian Sea. This would include the ancient Etruscans, and it must be that we have here the clue to the origin of this enigmatic race. There is a certain affinity between Etruscan and Minoan art, but there is no sign of any contact between the peoples. May it not be that with the destruction of 1450 BC and the disappearance of the Cretan fleet, the Etruscans forgot about their earlier connection with Atlantis and could never account for their own origin? It is also possible that we can connect the Cretans with the Hyksos, who dominated Egypt for centuries and seem to have come from nowhere and disappeared no one knows whither. This kind of thing can happen with sea power. For 200 years, the British dominated India without a land invasion. When British sea power ceased to rule the waves, British rule soon disappeared from India. And if in 3,000 or 4,000 years archaeologists attempt to reconstruct the history of this century, they would find it hard to explain who were the people that came to India and disappeared as mysteriously as they had arrived. I am just making these suggestions to show you how much we may be able to find out about the history of the second millennium BC if we understand better what was the rise and fall of Atlantis, which has been arbitrarily described by Evans as the Minoan kingdom, and may also have had many other names. This is not the whole story, for the great catastrophe of Santorin produced effects beyond the reach of its tidal waves. The great explosion did not disturb the water only. It also produced an enormous air pressure that was released in 2 ways. One was an explosive wave that traveled rapidly, and the other was an upward air current that produced great storms, rain, and hail. There were also the prodigious quantities of fine dust that must have traveled for hundreds of miles. We know that the Krakatoa eruption produced total darkness at midday over an area of 5,000 square miles. Santorin must have produced similar effects upon a far greater scale. Remember that the dust layer round Krakatoa was 1 foot thick, and that round Santorin, after 3,500 years, is still more than 100 feet thick. Surely some record of such extraordinary events must have been preserved. If so, where should we look for them? Generally speaking, ancient inscriptions preserve only glorious stories of successful wars and great buildings. so we should not expect to find the story of a disaster on the walls of temples or on monuments. Moreover, the Greeks and the other peoples living in the coastal areas have left no records at all of what happened in the second millennium BC. We should naturally turn to Egypt, only a few hundred miles from Santorin, and directly in the line of the prevailing winds. Do you not think at once of the plagues of Egypt, described in the first 10 chapters of Exodus? Darkness over the land, stones of hail and rock pouring down, great winds, the Nile suddenly flooded and suddenly run dry with frogs and flies, infesting the towns, and most terrifying of all, the destruction of buildings so that there was not one house of the Egyptians in which there was not one dead. We may even need to ask, was Egypt Atlantis, as J. Gwyn Griffiths asks? Does not all this remind you of what I read last week of the great explosion at Krakatoa, the sound of which was heard in Australia 2,000 miles away, and the dust from which spread all over the earth, falling as far as Africa and Europe? To verify the suggestion that the plagues of Egypt coincided with the Santorin explosion, let us go back to chronology. Scholars are still uncertain as to the date of the Exodus. The simplest answer is given quite plainly in the Bible. In Kings the 6th it is written, "And it came to pass, in the 480th year, after the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of the reign of Solomon over Israel, in the month Zeo, he began to build a house to the Lord." Now, the reign of Solomon has been independently and accurately fixed as from 970 to 930 BC. A simple calculation shows that this would place the Exodus at 1446 or 1447 BC. This calculation was adopted by Sir Charles Marston in his book, The Bible is True, and he shows how well it agrees with what he found in the excavations of Jericho. There are 2 objections to this date. One is that the children of Israel are said in Exodus 12:37 to have set forward from Ramesses to Succoth. Now Rames, or Ramses, was the city of the pharaoh Ramses II, who reigned from 1298 to 1232 BC, and the name Ramses was not used in Egypt before the 19th dynasty. The discrepancy is easily explained. When the story of the Exodus was written centuries after the event, Ramses was the capital city, and the scribes used it to denote also the capitals of Egypt in earlier times. It appears, for example, in Genesis 47 as the city where Joseph settled his father and his brethren, at least 200 years earlier than the Exodus. We can, therefore, safely disregard the references to Ramses. A much more serious objection is that in 1450 BC the ruler of Egypt was Thutmoses III, the greatest conqueror of the second millennium. At that time he ruled over the whole of Syria and Mesopotamia, and over Egypt as far south as Nubia. It is inconceivable, say the scholars, that the children of Israel would have been able to leave Egypt and invade Canaan, of which Egypt was in complete control. They argue that the Exodus must have occurred under a weak ruler, such as the later pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. This is where we return to the providential interpretation of history. The scholars are right, but they do not take into account the miracle of synchronicity whereby earth events can change human history. It is true that Thutmoses III was a most powerful autocrat, but is that not the very picture that is drawn of Pharaoh in the book of Exodus? Nothing would have changed his heart but a terror before which he was powerless. Just such a terror was produced by the explosion of Santorini. Everything was there: noise, darkness, the wholesale destruction of cattle, crops and buildings, great rains, hail, and rock falling from the sky which no other catastrophe could have produced. Whereas Atlantis was destroyed, Egypt was plagued. The entire machinery of government must have been disrupted, and for a long time, years perhaps, the rulers would have no time to think of the departed Israelites. Is there any more specific evidence? The first and strangest is the date that Thutmose III died, the very year 1447 BC that the Bible assigns to the Exodus, the very time that I have assigned to the Santorin eruption and the destruction of Atlantis. From Exodus 15, it seems clear that the Pharaoh himself perished with his army, and this is confirmed by the traditions. Are we then to conclude that Thutmose III was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? This seems to conflict with Exodus 2:23, which records the death of the king of Egypt. I believe that the reference here is to Hatshepsut, who was the regent and effective ruler of Egypt until her death in 1480 BC. As is well known, she adopted a man's rights and was often referred to in the masculine gender. She was perhaps the pharaoh of the persecution, and her son Thutmose III was the pharaoh of the liberation. I would not venture to give an opinion about this, but I am convinced that the Exodus did take place about 1447 BC, that it coincided with the death of Thutmose III, and also with the destruction of Atlantis and the flood of Deucalion. I believe that no one has previously suggested a connection between Atlantis and the Exodus, but early Christian historians did connect Exodus with the Deucalion flood. Eusebius, in his chronicle, placed the flood of Deucalion and the conflagration of Phaeton in the 52nd year of Moses' life. Augustine, in The City of God, connects Deucalion's flood with the Exodus, City of God, Book 10, Chapter 8 and Chapter 9. I have not mentioned the story of Phaeton and the disappearance of the sun, but this may well be accounted for as the days of complete blackout caused by the Santorin dust. Moreover, we must not forget that the explosion itself probably produced a flash that might well have been mistaken for the burning up of the sun itself. You will recollect that the Greeks were as convinced of the historical reality of Deucalion and his flood as were the Jews of the miraculous liberation of the Jews from their Egyptian oppressors. It now seems that all these events were linked together by a common cause: the great Santorin catastrophe. If you will read Exodus, chapters 8 to 12, you will see for yourselves that the description fits all that we have seen about the effects of a stupendous volcanic eruption at a distance of a few hundred miles. You may, however, ask, is there any evidence from the Egyptian side that such things occurred? First of all, it was never the habit of the Egyptians to put into their records anything unpleasant. They wrote a great deal about all their conquests and all the grandeur of the pharaohs. But when unpleasant things happened, not so very much was said. But there is one remarkable exception to this. About 100 years ago, there, a papyrus was found in Memphis, near the pyramids, with a story on it that no one at first could understand, of a terrible situation that occurred in Egypt. It is called the Papyrus Ipuwer, and it is now in the Museum of Leiden in Holland. I will read you some extracts, and you will see that it is as if it was almost a reporter writing in the very presence of the calamity. Forsooth, the land turns round as does a potter's wheel. The towns are destroyed. All is ruin, ages of noise. There is no end to noise. Oh, that the earth would cease from noise, and tumult be no more. Trees are destroyed, no fruit nor herbs are found. Lower Egypt weeps, the entire palace is without support. No fruit nor herbs are found. Hunger, all animals, their hearts weep. Cattle moan, there is no light in the land. There was a great cry in Egypt. It is groaning throughout the land, mingled with lamentations. The land was in great affliction. Evil fell on this earth. Nobody left the palace during 9 days. And during these 9 days of upheaval, there was such a tempest that neither the men nor the gods could see the faces of their next. I felt, when I first read this account of an Egyptian scribe, that he might have been watching, been present, and that the very kind of things that one would connect with that great catastrophe in Santorini, when you are far enough away not to be blown to pieces by it, but near enough to feel the blast and experience all the terrors. It has been calculated, by the way, that that force of the explosion was greater than 430 of the largest hydrogen bombs that could be made, all going off together. That would not give one much chance to survive within 100 miles. And of course, no record would be left by anyone living within that distance of the catastrophe itself. But several hundred miles away, in Egypt, it would be just this kind of thing that you would expect to have described by somebody who actually saw it. If it is to be accepted that Moses was warned and knew that this would come, then one can understand that he would know that it was the moment for the children of Israel to go free. It would also explain how it would be that after the catastrophe, nothing was done to interfere with them. If, as is recorded in the Midrashim, the Pharaoh himself perished at that time, then that would correspond with the death of Thutmoses III. I would like to say just one more thing about floods before we stop. There is an extraordinary similarity, as you probably know, between the story of the Deucalion flood, the story of the flood of Noah, and the flood of Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh epic. One might say that they all referred to the same event, but this is geographically very unlikely. There could not be that kind of sudden event which produces great floods over such enormous areas. Changes of the ocean bed are too slow to produce anything that could correspond to these various flood stories. But as we can see from Krakatau, from the one in Alaska, from this great one at Santorin, a certain situation can arise where the earth blows up in the sea and produces these flood conditions coupled with long and unceasing rainfall. And it seems, on the whole, likely that there have been different floods when survival depended upon people who were able to take refuge, who were at a sufficient distance from the center to float through them on a raft or ship. A great deal of light can be thrown on these flood stories, of which there are many in the different traditions of the world, by the work of Professor Galanopoulos on the effects of a submarine volcano. Such things do occur from time to time, especially in the earthquake belt, and when they occur, then you have conditions that do correspond to all descriptions of floods. My own belief is that these kinds of things cannot be ascribed just to an accident of time. As I said last week, the miracle is in the timing, in the synchronicity. The mechanism is natural. Everything that I have described today, as far as the mechanism of its occurrence is concerned, obeys quite natural laws. No problem arises from the point of view of geologists, seismologists, or climatologists in explaining how such things could occur. But that they should have happened just then, and just in such a way, that is against all probability. And of course, if it is really true, this suggestion that I have thrown out tonight. If these three remarkable events of ancient history, the flood of Deucalion, the destruction of Atlantis, and the plagues of Egypt, and the Exodus, did all occur in one event, then it is one of the strangest and most important of the natural catastrophes that have changed the course of history, and this knowledge cannot fail to strengthen the conviction that there is a providential working that connects earth happenings with human history. In Lucian's account of Deucalion flood, the generality of people, he says, tells us that the founder of the temple was Deucalion Sisythes, that Deucalion in whose time the great inundation occurred. I have also heard the account given by the Greeks themselves of Deucalion. The myth runs thus: the actual race of men is not the first, for there was a previous one, all the members of which perished. We belong to a second race, descended from Deucalion and multiplied in the course of time. As to the former men, they are said to have been full of insolence and pride, committing many crimes, disregarding their oath, neglecting the rights of hospitality, unsparing to suppliants. Accordingly, they were punished by an immense disaster. All, on a sudden, enormous volumes of water issued from the earth, and rains of extraordinary abundance began to fall. The rivers left their beds, and the sea overflowed its shores. The whole earth was covered with water, and all men perished. Deucalion alone, because of his virtue and piety, was preserved alive to give birth to a new race. This is how he was saved. He placed himself, his children, and his wives in a great coffer that he had, in which pigs, horses, lions, serpents, and all other terrestrial animals came to seek refuge with him. He received them all, and while they were in the coffer, Zeus inspired them with reciprocal amity, which prevented their devouring one another. In this manner, shut up within one single coffer, they floated as long as the waters remained in force. Such is the account given by the Greeks of Deucalion. But to this, which they equally tell, the people of Hierapolis add a marvelous narrative, that in their country a great chasm opened, into which all the waters of the deluge poured. Then Deucalion raised an altar and dedicated a temple to Hera at Argatis, close to this very chasm. I have seen it. It is very narrow and situated under the temple. Whether it was once large and has now shrunk, I do not know, but I have seen it, and it is quite small. In memory of the event, the following is the rite accomplished. Twice a year, sea water is brought to the temple. This is not only done by the priests, but numerous pilgrims come from the whole of Syria and Arabia, and even from beyond the Euphrates, bringing water. It is poured out in the temple and goes into the cleft, which, narrow as it is, swallows up a considerable quantity. This is said to be in virtue of a religious law instituted by Deucalion to preserve the memory of the catastrophe, and of the benefits that he received from the gods. Such is the ancient tradition of the temple at the north gate, of which there stood two great columns, each about 360 feet high, and that once a year a man climbed to the top and sat there for 7 days to signify how men had ascended to the tops of mountains to escape from the waters. Lucian, about 170 BC, from the book of the Syrian goddess. The date of Deucalion is given on the Parian inscription as about 1530 BC. Connection between destruction of Atlantis and Deucalion's flood. Plato's Critias, 112. In the first place, the Acropolis was not as now. For the fact is that a single night of excessive rain washed away the earth and laid bare the rock. At the same time, there were earthquakes, and then occurred the third extraordinary inundation, which immediately preceded the great destruction of Deucalion. But in primitive times, the hill of the Acropolis extended to the Eridanus Ilissus, and included the Pnyx on one side, and the Lycabettus as a boundary on the opposite side to the Nyx, and was all well covered with soil, and level at the top, except in one or two places. Outside the Acropolis, and on the sides of the hill, there dwelt artisans, and such of the husbandmen as were tilling the ground near. At the summit, the warrior class dwelt by themselves around the temples of Athena and Hephaestus, in one enclosure which was like the garden of a single house. Where the Acropolis now is, there was a single fountain, which was extinguished by the earthquake, and has left only a few small streams which still exist. But in those days the fountain gave an abundant supply of water, which was of equal temperature in summer and winter. So in conclusion, the destruction happened in the homeland of the Greeks, but the island paradise may very well have been Egypt, if not Crete.